The dawn mist clung to the window panes of the house on the hill like lace, delicate and reluctant to lift. A girl stood behind the sheer curtains, silent in a gown of blue silk, watching the grounds below where the hired men led chestnut horses to water. Her name was Evelyn Thorne, and she had not spoken in 7 years. The silence began in Charleston, a place she no longer let herself remember in full. Only the thunder of hooves and fire, orange crawling over whitewashed walls, remained. Her mother's scream had vanished into the black, and Evelyn's voice with it. Now 17 and near woman, she was a ghost in her uncle's home outside St. Louis. Each morning her maid would brush her dark hair and dress her in finery, then leave her to wander the vast house like a mourning dove. She moved through parlors and libraries without a sound, her gloved hands trailing along polished banisters and gilded frames. She would sit at her pianoforte in the afternoons and let her fingers speak what her lips could not, soft melodies like prayers, sometimes stormier, when the ache grew too loud. Her uncle, Judge Thorne, was a hard man of few words himself, but not of softness. He'd taken her in as a duty, not a mercy, and though he never raised a hand, his house was carved from cold stone. He had plans for Evelyn, plans that involved a suitable marriage to a family of equal standing. That she could not speak only made her more docile in his eyes, a fine, silent wife for some banker's son. She felt like a statue being carved by invisible blades. It was during one of those quiet mornings, seated on the garden bench, when she first saw the stranger. He was with her cousin Matthew, a wild-limbed boy turned man too fast, whose latest folly was to explore the frontier with a survey team heading west. The stranger stood beside the supply wagon, speaking low with Matthew, though Evelyn could not hear the words. He was tall, lean, with hair black as river stone and skin the color of weathered copper. His clothes were simple, canvas and hide, and he wore them like the forest warbark, unbothered by eyes or silence. Something in him stilled her more than fear ever had. Later at supper, Matthew spoke of the expedition. They were bound for Wyoming territory, where rivers cut through mountains like blades through cloth, and the land still breathed untouched. They needed maps drawn, timber scouted, threats assessed. Judge Thorne approved, though he disliked Matthew's recklessness. Evelyn ate in silence, the voices around her dull and far away. That night she found herself standing again behind the curtain, watching stars appear in the dark. She did not know the man's name, but her chest ached with a feeling she had no word for. Not love, not yet, something quieter, like the space before music begins. 2 weeks passed. Matthew left with the survey team and the stranger with him. Evelyn returned to her routines, though something had shifted inside her. She began to spend more time outside, even walking alone through the woods that bordered the estate. The wind had a voice, and in it she heard fragments of herself. Then came the letter. Written in Matthew's hasty hand, it arrived 2 months later, bearing news both grim and strange. A flash flood had swept through their camp. Men had drowned. Matthew survived but was laid up with a broken leg. The survey was over, but he wrote of the man who had pulled him from the river, Elan, a Shoshone guide. He owed his life to him, and Elan had promised to see him safely back. Evelyn read the letter again and again. Elan. She traced the name with a finger, a short name but strong. She tucked the page beneath her pillow and slept with it near. Weeks turned to months. Winter touched the fields. When Matthew returned, thinner and humbled, Elan was not with him. Evelyn pressed him with a look, and Matthew, startled by her intensity, said only that Elan had chosen to stay near his people through the winter. He walks between two worlds, he said, but he belongs more to theirs than ours. Still, Evelyn would walk to the woods each dawn, pausing at the edge of the trees, listening. Sometimes she thought she heard movement beyond the branches. Not animal, not wind, a presence. She never went farther, though she wanted to. Something tethered her still, silk, expectation, fear. But threads can fray. One night Evelyn found herself seated at the piano, the fire low behind her. Her uncle entered, trailed by a man with pale eyes and a sharper smile. Judge Thorne laid a hand on her shoulder. "Mr. Wexley is interested in courting you," he said. Evelyn froze. Mr. Wexley spoke of future plans, of commerce, of how he admired a quiet wife. He smiled as if she were an object he'd already purchased. Evelyn heard nothing beyond the roar in her ears. She rose, bowed her head, and left the room without a sound. That night she packed a bag. She took only what she could carry, a worn cloak, sturdy boots, a pouch of coins, and the letter. Before dawn, she slipped from the house and down the dirt road, walking west with the stars. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to move, had to breathe, had to stop being carved into someone else's shape. Somewhere beyond the horizon was a man named Elan, and the mountains that cradled silence and wind and truth. Her days had begun in silk and silence. But something wild stirred now in her chest, and it carried the scent of pine. The first snow came on the third day of her journey. It was not a storm but a hush, a soft settling over the world that muffled each footfall and turned every branch into a white sculpture. Evelyn pulled her cloak tighter and kept walking, her breath a ghost before her, her boots cutting a steady rhythm into the blank trail. The road had long since become a track, and now even that was buried. She followed the creek upstream, as an old trapper at a trading post had advised. "Creek'll lead you west," he'd said, not bothering to ask why a mute girl traveled alone. West, toward the Tetons, toward the people who walked between the worlds. She had no map, only instinct and the sun when it showed itself. Her hands cracked with cold. Hunger gnawed at her ribs, but she rationed the dry bread and smoked meat she carried, trading coins for scraps at scattered outposts along the way. She learned to sleep with one hand curled around a small knife and how to start fire from wet wood. There were dangers. Once a man tried to follow her from a camp, thinking her an easy mark. He stopped when he saw the knife, and the way she looked him in the eye, unflinching. Another time, a pair of wolves shadowed her for half a day before veering off. She kept walking. Weeks passed. She no longer felt like a girl made of glass. The silk dresses lived only in memory now, faded like the tapestries in her uncle's halls. Her face grew lean, her legs strong. The world around her changed too, less tame, more vast. Pines thickened, hills rose, rivers ran fast and ice-rimmed. One dusk, deep in the Wind River Valley, she came upon a group of children chasing one another through the trees near a winter camp. Their laughter rang clear through the frost. A woman, older, eyes keen as flint, spotted Evelyn and rose from her cooking fire. Others turned too, watching the stranger approach. Evelyn stopped a few paces away, breath shallow. She reached into her satchel, pulled out the crumpled letter and held it out. The woman stepped forward and took it, her gaze never leaving Evelyn's face. She read slowly, then looked up. "Elan is not here," she said in a measured voice, "but he comes when the ice breaks. If you wait, you may see him." Evelyn nodded, lowering her eyes. They let her stay. The days passed in quiet rhythms she came to cherish. She helped where she could, hauling water, scraping hides, watching over the little ones who circled her legs with unguarded curiosity. They called her Hata, quiet girl, and she accepted the name like a gift. Though the others spoke around her, no one pressed her to speak back. Silence was not foreign here, it was woven into the way they lived. She listened. She learned. The older woman, whose name was Tahu, taught her to tan buckskin and mend moccasins. Evelyn shed her last remaining dress one evening and stepped into soft deerskin. She wore no corset, no lace, only the warmth of something that moved as she did. At night she sat by the fire and watched the stars through the smoke. Her hands no longer trembled. Her eyes had begun to find rest in stillness. Spring came slowly. The ice retreated, the rivers swelled. On the first warm morning, a rider appeared along the ridge. He dismounted with ease, leading his pony down through the trees. Evelyn stood. He was older than she remembered, more weathered, his hair longer, braided with rawhide and beads. But the way he moved, the way his gaze met hers, quiet and steady, it struck the same note that had once halted her heart in a garden of roses. "Elan," she signed, the name shaped not with lips, but with fingers Tahu had taught her to use. He nodded, a flicker of something moving across his face. Recognition, surprise, memory. "You came far," he said. She stepped closer, searching his face for anger, for confusion, for anything that might undo her. Instead, he said, "Are you staying?" She didn't answer, not with voice, not with signs. She simply reached out, her hand brushing his, roughened by bark and bowstring. And stayed. The thaw soaked the earth, and with it Evelyn learned the rhythm of mud and melt. The winter camp broke open like a seed under sunlight, and people began to move upstream toward higher pasture, where elk would return and the berries would fatten. She traveled with them now, her feet sure, her hands calloused and capable. Elan did not ask questions she couldn't answer. In his quiet way, he watched her as she folded into their world, not as one of them, not yet, but not foreign either. She belonged by doing, lifting poles, stitching seams, running beside the pack horses. And when they camped at night, she sat beside him, sharing warmth and silence. It was not the kind of courtship spoken of back east. There were no ballrooms, no chaperoned walks under chandeliers. There was a night when they stood waist-deep in river, stringing nets side by side, her hands purple with cold, his smile flickering when she caught her first trout. There was a morning she awoke to find a small carved flute left beside her bedroll. And there was a moment beneath a red willow tree where his fingers brushed hers, not in possession but in promise. She began to dream again, not of cities or fine houses, but of wide skies and the smell of wood smoke in her hair. She learned the shape of Elan's laugh, rare and low, like thunder at a distance. She learned the names of birds, the way to cut meat thin and dry it in the sun, the difference between silence that guards and silence that gives. Still, not all was peace. Word came one evening, carried by a breathless rider, a skirmish near South Pass. White settlers had taken a boy, claiming he stole a horse. The boy's father rode out to speak with them and did not return. Tensions, the elders said, would rise like floodwater. The camp would move farther into the high country. That night, Evelyn could not sleep. She found Elan at the edge of camp, where the firelight gave way to dark. "They will come," he said without looking at her, "to take land or blood or both." She placed her hand on his chest, over the place where his heartbeat kept time with her own. She did not need words to ask the question. He looked at her then, really looked, and in his eyes was the ache of a man who had loved and lost too much already. "If you stay," he said, "there will be hardship, it will not be safe." She nodded. And so, when the camp moved, she moved too. She helped load travois, tied down bundles with thick knots, sang with the women who walked behind the ponies. Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain at first, but it grew. Their new home was a hidden valley near a stream so clear you could see fish darting beneath the surface. Children chased dragonflies through the grass. Elan built a lodge from willow and hide, and though nothing was said aloud, its door faced east. He invited her in, once the hearth was built and the floor laid with skins. She crossed the threshold. That night, as wind curled soft around the walls and firelight danced on the roof poles, Evelyn lay beside him, and for the first time in years, she spoke. Her voice was rough with disuse, shaped more by breath than tone. "My name," she said, "is Evelyn." Elan turned to her slowly, as if witnessing the first bloom of spring. "And you are not afraid." She swallowed. "I was," she said, "but not now." He closed his hand over hers. They said nothing more. Outside, the creek sang on through the dark. Summer in the high valley was a season of brightness and breath. The days stretched long and golden, thick with bee song and the smell of sweetgrass. The land held its own music, pine branches sighing, river stones shifting, the quiet rustle of deer in the underbrush. Evelyn rose each morning before the sun crested the ridge and stood at the creek to wash her hands, her face, the memories that still clung like soot. In this new life, she was no longer someone's ward, no longer a name etched beside a family crest. She was a woman who carried water, whose fingers stained with berry juice, whose arms held children not her own when their mothers needed a moment's rest. There was peace in being useful, in the small rituals that stitched each day together. She tanned hides with Tahu, learned to track elk alongside Elan, to recognize the warning signs in the sky when weather turned cruel. Her voice returned slowly, like thawed ground beneath snow. She did not speak often nor loudly, but the words came with purpose when they came. The children would listen close when she named stars or told them stories from her old world, strange tales of steeples and staircases, of gowns and glass. They laughed and asked for more. In their eyes, she saw no pity, only curiosity. They did not ask her to be anything but what she was. Elan watched her in those moments, quiet pride stitched into the corners of his mouth. He was not a man of speeches, but of gesture. He carved a set of combs from bone and left them wrapped in cloth at her bedside. He taught her to shoot with a bow, standing behind her, guiding her arms until the arrow flew true. He listened when she spoke, and even when she didn't. But outside their valley, trouble gathered like smoke behind the hills. Riders came, uninvited, bearing the seal of the U.S. cavalry. Their blue coats sharp against the green, they rode into the valley with questions and warnings, their hands too near their rifles. Evelyn stood behind Elan as he spoke with the captain, his voice calm, his face carved from stone. The captain's eyes flicked to her, lingered. Later, Elan told her what he would not say before them. They will ask us to leave, or they will try to take what we do not give. Evelyn understood. She had known such men before, their certainty, their polished boots, the way they believed the land itself owed them obedience. A decision had to be made. That night the council met. Elders spoke of history, of trails once walked and treaties broken. Some argued to stay, others to scatter and return later. Elan remained silent until the fire burned low, then stood. "This place is not ours to lose," he said. "It is in us, we carry it." The next morning they began to prepare, not for flight but for return. North toward Wind River where kin waited. It would be a long journey but safer ground. Evelyn packed beside Elan. Their lodge came down like breath drawn in reverse, each lash undone with care. The valley would hold no trace of them when they left, only the memory of their fire and the echo of their songs. But Evelyn did not feel displaced, not this time. She had learned the truth in Elan's words, the land lived in her now. The creek's song was in her blood, the smoke had never left her, but it no longer choked, it warmed. As they rode out in a line beneath the bright sun, she looked back once at the place where she'd found her voice again. Not with sorrow, but with reverence. They did not belong to the land. They belonged with each other. The journey north was neither swift nor without trial. They moved like shadow and stream, quiet, deliberate, keeping to wooded passes and the shoulders of hills. Evelyn rode near the middle of the line, a woven scarf covering her hair against the sun, her bow and quiver slung across her back. The pony beneath her was lean and sure-footed, and she had learned to ride as the others did, without saddle, with balance rooted not in reins but in breath and trust. They crossed rivers swollen with melt, braved sudden storms that turned daylight to slate. Once they came upon a settlement smoldering in the wake of violence, the ground littered with bootprints and burned hopes. Elan guided them away before questions could rise, his face drawn tight with memory. Evelyn knew better than to ask what he saw in such places. Some pain cannot be told, only endured and shared in silence. Each night they built small fires tucked deep in the trees, speaking little. The children were taught to hush laughter, the dogs kept close and quiet. Evelyn found herself scanning each ridge before sleeping, her fingers curled round her knife, even when Elan lay beside her. She was no longer the girl who watched danger through lace curtains. She had walked into the world and let it mark her. Still, not all was fear. One dusk, as they reached a ridge where the wind carried the scent of distant sage, Elan stopped his horse and motioned for Evelyn to join him. The valley below rolled out like a painted dream, open, vast, lit by the sun sinking into red behind the mountains. He handed her a small, fur-wrapped bundle. Inside, she found a necklace strung with shells, carved bone, and one bright blue bead. "For your name," he said, "the one only you can carry." She touched the bead, unsure whether it meant her voice, her journey, or something he saw in her still unspoken. He looked out across the land, his profile caught in the last light. "We're close now." They reached the Wind River camp 2 days later. It was larger than the one they had left, pulsing with life, lodges nestled like river stones among pines, smoke curling into a sky wide as memory. Relatives greeted them with laughter and clasped hands, stories spilling in every direction. Children wove through the ponies, women brought food before questions. The smell of roasted roots and bison filled the air. Songs drifted from the far side of the camp, voices rising into evening. For Evelyn, it was like walking into a place she had never known, but always needed. That night under the great canopy of stars, the elders called a gathering. Stories were shared, not just of old battles or spirits, but of the journey they had made and of those who had come to walk with them. When Elan rose to speak, his words were spare but carried weight. "We have returned," he said, "not to reclaim land, but to remember what holds us together." Then he looked to Evelyn, and the camp fell quiet. "She is not of our blood," he said, "but she walks with us, she listens, she learns, she has known fire and did not let it consume her, her name is hers, and now she is part of our circle." A hush followed, not of doubt, but of respect. Evelyn stood, her legs steady beneath her. She looked out at the faces, some curious, some kind, none rejecting. She placed a hand over her chest, over the blue bead that now lay there. "I am home," she said. The words were small, but the silence that followed was full of recognition. Autumn crept in not with fanfare but with quiet certainty. Leaves turned gold along the riverbanks, the air sharpened, and the smoke from the lodges hung low and fragrant. The pace of life shifted. Hunts grew longer, colder. Hands moved faster to stitch, to gather, to prepare. Evelyn's fingers, once soft and ceremonial, grew deft with sinew and thread. She could shape a pair of moccasins by heart now. She had learned the songs for curing meat, for calling children home, for sending someone safely into sleep. She sang more often now. Not always aloud, but through her work, her steps, the way her body moved in rhythm with those around her. When the little ones tugged at her skirts, calling her sister in their tongue, she'd laugh, and they'd laugh too, their faces painted with light. Elan built them a new lodge before the frost set in, not out of obligation but choice. Its walls held no grandeur, only warmth. There was a simple shelf for her beads and a place where her combs rested beside his tools. In the evenings, they sat close, sharing smoked root and silence, broken now and then by a soft word or the breath of a shared memory. He told her one night of the first time he'd seen her, standing in that distant garden, blue dress gleaming against a dying sun. "I knew," he said, voice low, "you didn't belong to that place. You stood like a bird behind glass." "And now," she asked, her fingers idly brushing the hem of his sleeve. "Now you sing." Snow came early that year, the kind that muffled even the bravest sounds. The lodge filled with its own quiet music, the hiss of water heating over coals, the rustle of hide against fur, the slow beat of two hearts learning how to live beside one another without fear. One morning, Evelyn stood beside the creek, wrapped in a mantle of thick wool. Frost kissed the edges of the water and smoke rose faint behind her from the camp. She watched the fish beneath the surface, their bodies silver and strong. Elan came up beside her, carrying a small cedar box. He said nothing, only offered it. Inside, nestled in a bed of feathers, lay a length of painted buckskin. On it were symbols she recognized: mountains, river, a woman, a bird with outstretched wings. "It is your story," he said, "as we see it." She traced the bird, her throat thick. There were no grand declarations, no crowds or processions, only the wind through pine and the warmth of his hand on her back. She turned to him and pressed her forehead to his, their breath mixing in the cold. "I love you," she said simply. He closed his eyes. "I have always loved you," he answered. That winter passed with its own kind of beauty. The days were short, the nights long, but they were full. Evelyn carried water, carved patterns into leather, braided little girls' hair. She no longer feared who she had been. She no longer needed the world's approval to know her place in it. One night near the end of the season, she woke to the sound of the creek outside. It sang louder now, the ice breaking at last. She stepped outside, the snow soft beneath her feet, and looked to the stars. She thought of her mother's voice, dim but not gone. She thought of the silk dresses, folded somewhere in a chest hundreds of miles away. She thought of the fire that had ended one life and lit the path to another. And she sang. Low, wordless, shaped from memory and newness alike. A song of leaving and finding, of names taken and names reclaimed, of a woman who had once been silent, now stitched into the earth by love, by grit, by choice. Her days had begun in silk and silence. They ended in buckskin and song beside a creek with a Shoshone husband.